Imagine a server with double Fairchild 3. What can you do? So we get into this game and I want to talk about my opening hand real quick. This is a very hard hand to keep. Most of the time you wouldn't. There's a cutlery, which is not that good. Two mediums, which will probably not come into play. Most HB players will double ice the central's first turn. And then you have the thing that makes it really hard. Inject into retrieval run. Now I don't know what my opponent is playing. It could be Rushy HB, it could be food codes. Having access to an early Faust or David very early on through inject retrieval run is actually kind of a big deal. On the same token though, what you really want to start off with is some form of economy. Liberated accounts, a Temujin contracts, or even the sure gamble. And this just doesn't cut it. This doesn't reliably draw you that, and even if it does, you could get a bad inject without programs. And if you hit an inject into liberated accounts and no programs, you're stuck on 4 credits and a very awkward situation. You can try to get the liberated accounts down, but that means you have to discard cards from your hand, and that's pretty bad. So I did decide to mulligan this. I got a slightly worse hand, which was a problem, but this mulligan was probably justified. So now knowing that Escalation and Fairchild 3.0 are out, your rule number 1 is always run first click if you're not completely set up, if you're not prepared to deal with it. And that is very important. You really cannot afford to eat the subroutines of a Fairchild 3.0. My opponent opens without ice on archives, instead going for the ice on remote, which clues me in that my opponent's running a rush style HB. So I can probably expect the first thing that he chucks behind the remote to be an agenda, probably an ABT that will get him further in the game. Now I can't contest that. I could run there first click, but it could be an architect. It could be bait, very likely, and sure it is an advanced assembly line. So yes, this is Rushy HB, and well, not really. We get an Adonis. Okay, that's interesting. So that is not really Rushy HB. Adonis clues you into the fact that that's more food codes, and you wanted to get the remote ice up ASAP so that he could actually make this play. A safe Adonis behind an ice, that makes it very difficult for me to trash. Now he puts an ice on archives, which I think is a big mistake. He should be protecting the Adonis, because now I can just simply run that remote and click through the Turing. I was hovering my mouse over the minus click, but then I realized I do have a David and a spoon in hand. So I think it kind of makes sense for me to jack out here and destroy the Turing, and that's exactly what I did. You want to destroy the ice as soon as they are raised, because you don't want your opponent to stack worse ice on top of it. Something like a Fairchild, for example. Of course, you'd rather use the spoon on a Fairchild 3.0 or even a 2.0 rather than Turing, but every ice you can destroy is a benefit, because that's one less remote ice you have to deal with, one more remote ice the opponent has to find, and that gets rid of the spoon from your hand. This means that you can draw more cards and not have to keep the spoon in hand all the time. Now, I got baited into running that remote again because I thought that was an agenda. That was an attempt at agenda when I had very few cards in hand. Turned out it was an architect. This set me back real bad. As much as the spoon was a good play by me, the architect was a bad play. This allowed my opponent to gain a lot of ground. They got to see the top 5 cards of their R&D, plan out the next few turns, and get a good idea of how they could proceed on with the game. If my opponent found a lot of ice on R&D, he could easily set up another remote, or stack up this remote and get the Adonis recurring. Remember that there's an Adonis and an advanced assembly lines in archive, so my opponent has a lot of options. They could go for the longer haul by setting up a new remote with the Adonis, or chill out and just get more money for the time being using advanced assembly lines and installing a random piece of ice. In this case, my opponent fortifies the remote, which is the smart thing to do. This makes it basically impossible for me to contest the remote for the next few turns, and then he goes for the advanced assembly lines. I do hit the bottom of the server and it's another Adonis, so that explains why my opponent chose the assembly lines. My opponent does not install anything with AAL here. He could install another piece of ice. The fact that he didn't do that clues me, well, okay. He wouldn't install another piece of ice because he already used his HB credit on the Architect Fire, so it doesn't make sense for him to use the advanced assembly lines. He just fires the Architect for +2 credits on the assembly lines, and then I have to trash it. I can't let him have the advanced assembly lines next turn. So I tried to angle myself for a better board state come next turn, but there's no way I'm getting through that remote, make no mistake. Even though I have the Faust in hand, I'm not running through that remote unless my opponent blatantly advances a global food in there. So I'm just going to set up here with Liberator accounts, Faust, and get ready for a one-turn destruction. That is what I'm really angling for here, given that my opponent hasn't found a Jackson Howard, or, well, scrap that. My opponent has found a Jackson Howard, and that went in the remote last turn, so this turn is first click draw. Second click install Ice on R&D. And the third click is upgrade in the remote. So that's probably an Ash, could be a CVS, but either way, this is quite interesting. This means that my opponent might not necessarily be agenda flooded. If they were, they would hyperdraw with Jackson and ditch agendas. And I asked for Rumor Mill here. My opponent does not trigger for Rumor Mill, so there is a very good chance that my opponent is not actually agenda flooded. Maybe he had 2 agendas in hand, one of which is now in archives, and one's in hand. I think at this point, I'm thinking, okay, so this might not necessarily be the best chance for me to go for one turn. So what I'm going to do is draw a bunch of cards and go for the Jackson Howard. Okay, so one turn destruction is obviously not a good thing to use when your opponent has Jackson Howard on the table for obvious reasons. If agendas hit the bin, you're not going to be able to steal them. Jackson brings them back. There's no Rumor Mill in this deck. So I was basically drawing to try to clear the Jackson, because the last thing I want is for my opponent to draw more cards and clear more agendas from hand. That's bad news for me. That accelerates my opponent's game heavily and makes the one turn a lot less useful. So I'm trying to clear the Jackson here. Bad news is this is not going well. I hit a Fairchild 3.0. I do have a partial David out, so I could theoretically spend 2 David counters and pay 3 credits, but I really want to save the David for the spoon. With 2 David counters, it means that I only need to pay 3 cards or 2 cards and a sucker to get past the Fairchild. But yeah, I chose to actually eat 1 subroutine and pay 4 cards with Faust. So Fairchild gives you that flexibility. It allows you to pay in whatever means you find most convenient. And there I chose to pay the cards with Faust because I spent my first 3 clicks drawing. So I get through the remote and the Jackson gets cleared. I also expend my Data Sucker counter to get past the Strength 3 Architect. In the process, I leave myself with 2 cards. Obelus, which I must keep because that's my last console. I already ditched 1 Obelus, I can't afford to ditch the second. The other card I keep is Spoon, for obvious reasons. Next turn, if my opponent is unaware of it, I am going to Spoon the Fairchild 3.0. That is a very, very critical thing to do, whether you're up against Polana with DNA Tracker, NBN with Toll Booth, or HB with Fairchild 3.0. The first, you must always be aware, as a Dumble Fox player, that you need to spoon these eyes as soon as you can. And this is why I leave myself with David tokens to do so. Against Fairchild 3.0, you actually have a much easier time, because you're in HB. This means that you don't have to worry about Marcus Petty or Nisei Mark II. And most importantly, you can actually do this. Click through the 3.0 completely and jack out. That's exactly what I did. Burn my entire turn to do it, but it's worth it because this greatly lowers the amount of defenses on my opponent's remote, meaning that they can't just chain the genders out and they can't just snowball to victory. They must find another replacement ice, and it better be as good as the Fairchild 3.0 that I just trashed. Otherwise, I'm getting in very easily. Of course, I'm sacrificing board state to do so. I cannot contest the remote next turn. Very hard to do so, given I only have 1 card in hand, but that's fine, I think. That is until my opponent started playing interns. Oh gosh, yeah, I know what's coming. When I saw the interns, I knew what was coming. That Fairchild 3.0 was coming back with a vengeance. So that kind of undid all my hard work, but, well, at least I got rid of the interns, I guess. And for 6 credits to rest the interns. But this is, rest the 3.0 again. But this is not good for me at all. That is not a good trade for me. And I can't really do anything about that, so I have to build up my board state once more by drawing cards. And I find the daily cast. Very tempting to play the daily cast here, but money is not exactly what I need right now. Right now I need cards for files to challenge servers. I also draw my second copy of Wanton Destruction, which I can definitely see being used, as my opponent is collecting cards in hand, but not scoring agendas. I'm waiting for the Biotic Label to come at any point right now, but it doesn't seem like it's coming. And there's also Employee Strike in my hand. It's very good against HB. I can see myself playing it sometime soon. So at this point, I'm actually losing the game. It doesn't look like it, but in reality, I'm not actually doing a good job at controlling my opponent. My early aggression did not really pay off. I was not able to get an early one-turn destruction. I was not able to run R&D. I wasn't even able to find agendas off the remote because he wasn't putting agendas in there. As a result, score 0-0 and my opponent is solidifying. There are 2 eyes on each critical server. And even though I'm playing the employee strike here, I know that it's going to have not a very big effect. My opponent has an Eve campaign ticking, so they are going to be rich in no time. It's still important to deny HP credits, don't get me wrong. My opponent only has 1 res piece of ice, so those credits are going to get drained very quickly. That being said, it's a lot more effective if you can actually keep the campaigns down and have the strikes out at the same time. The fact that I drew strikes so late was actually a rather big problem in my books. And now my opponent's actually good enough to actually start creating a second remote, and that's when you know things are getting out of hand. I start trying to draw with Inject. Hopefully this gives me the impetus to make apply some pressure on centrals, but the Injects are not working out. They're giving me money, they're trashing my programs, but this doesn't give me the cards in hand that I need. So at this point, I'm looking at my hand and wondering what I should install. This is quite tricky. I tossed the Obelus onto the board because, again, I don't want it clogging my hand. I know I need to install it at some point for the memory and for the draw. Temujin on HQ was a very tempting option. I'm not gonna lie. The problem with Temujin on HQ is that it telegraphs so obviously that the server I'm targeting is HQ, and I don't want that. I want a very surprise wanton destruction, which I placed right here. I'm taking the risk, hoping that my opponent doesn't have a Jackson on the table. It seems like if he's making a double upgrade plus asset server in server 4, the second server, it probably isn't Jackson. So I'm taking a risk here. I'm going to wanton, and basically, once I wanton, I'm able to get rid of every single card in my opponent's hand because they're down to 3 cards. This means that my opponent cannot save a Jackson Howard. The only way they're getting a Jackson Howard is either if it's on the table, which is not, you see the Adonis. So I'm very sure my opponent has no Jackson on the table or in hand. The only way they're getting a Jackson Howard is if they top deck it. If they do not top deck a Jackson on the next turn, I'm going to draw and run archives. My next turn is draw, run archives, and hopefully fetch a bunch of agendas. Again, my opponent is down to pretty much half their deck. The fact that they haven't scored any agendas and I haven't stolen any must mean that there are lots of agendas clogging up his hand that were destroyed by wanton destruction. So my opponent ices archives here, which is a very sure sign that I hit at least 2 agendas, and then plays archive memories to get something, a face down card, back into hand. I think it's pretty obvious at this point that he was trying to salvage an agenda. So I drew 3 times. I could run archives, but there's double ice there. My opponent is rich. He can easily rest double Fairchild against me, and that's quite scary. So I'm going for the sure thing. I'm going to run HQ instead, which only costs me 2 cards. The sucker token regenerates itself. I get to see the card that he brought back, and it was an ABT. That confirmed my suspicions. It confirmed that my opponent was flooded and got really badly hit by the wanton. He's trying to draw for Jackson Howard, and it does seem like he's not finding it. The Dirty Laundry on HQ that stole the ABT also drew me a card with Obelus, which allowed me to find an I've Had Worse. This allows me to actually draw a bunch of cards and get me the resources, which is the cards in hand, that I need to bust through archives. So after a couple more draws, I'm going for archives here. Triple ice is scary, but I hope I can get through it. The first is a Fairchild 3.0. Okay. If there's one time to use David, it is now. I'm not going to pitch all 5 out of 6 cards in my hand to this Fairchild, so I'm going to use 2 David counters. Let the first subroutine of Fairchild fire. I could pay 3 credits, but hey, why don't I just trash the David? It's not going to be useful anymore. I could regenerate it with Retrieval Run later anyway. I hit a second Fairchild 3.0. Again, with no clicks left, I am forced to eat the subroutines. I need to save the cards in my hand for breaking the last piece of ice. He still has a good number of credits, so I need to keep as many cards in my hand as possible. So I could use Data Sucker to actually bring down Fairchild Strength, and I probably should have, but instead I chose to ditch 3 cards to break the final subroutine, do 1 brain damage or end the run. Note that the brain versus end the run is decided by the corp, so he would definitely end the run, so I was forced to break it. The final ice was a Ravana 1.0. I was able to use Data Sucker and clear my entire hand. So very, very close there. I actually managed to have just enough resources to break through that nasty server, and what's my reward? It's 3 agendas. That just won me the game. So that basically explained why my opponent was so intent on icing up archives again and again. the game was in archives, and my opponent just couldn't find the Jackson Howard he needed. And I got really, really lucky. Running last click, I had just enough cards and data sucker counters to manipulate my way through the server. It seemed like I was playing very smart on that final server, especially with the maneuver to use 2 David counters and then trash the David with Fairchild 3. But there was actually a more optimal way I could have got through the server. Of course, this is assuming that I actually know the full contents of the server, knowing that it is Fairchild 3 into Fairchild 3 into Ravana 1. If I did not know that, the play that I made was probably the most optimal you would get. But if I had known, what I actually could have done was this sequence here. With the resources I had, as a player, Netrunner player, you don't think of resources as just clicks and credits. There's also your board state, your sucker counters, and the number of cards in your hand because you're using files to break subroutines. So for the first Fairchild 3, I should only have spent 1 David counter and then eat the 2 subroutines, the first 2 subroutines, and pay 6 credits. The second Fairchild, I could have paid 3 more credits and that would use up all the credits that I had. However, I could then use the last David counter and then trash the David for the second Fairchild 3, and that gets me past. With this, I did not have to spend a single card on Faust or a single sucker counter to get past any of the Fairchilds, and that's quite key because this means that I can actually just spend 3 cards and a sucker on the last Ravana, leaving me with 3 cards in hand at the end of the run instead of 0, which is quite advantageous. Because obviously I could have kept the cards that I really wanted to keep, and it would leave me in a better board state for the next turn. So this was actually the optimal way to do it, but as I said, given that I didn't know the contents of the server at all, bumping into the first Fairchild 3 on archives, it made a lot of sense to just use both David counters and then trash David. As for Fairchild 3 shenanigans, you notice that there's so many ways you can play around it. You can break it with clicks, credits, you can break it by trashing your cards, David counters, there's so many ways you can get past it. So always consider your options before actually committing to breaking the ice. David with 2 counters in particular is very powerful because you can actually afford to be more liberal with face checking. In my case, I used the first David counter on an early remote Turing, and the remaining Davids were still enough for me to get through a single Fairchild once. Note that this is not a good idea if you do plan to spoon the Fairchild 3.0 with a full David. You need to break all 3 subroutines, paying 3 credits, or trashing your David, empty David to the Fairchild 3 does not constitute breaking the subroutine. It won't trigger spoon. It also means that keeping an empty David installed on the table is actually quite important against HB ETF because in that case, it's basically 3 credits for you saved if you are able to trash the David instead of suffering the 3 credit tax for the 1 subroutine. Also, the Fairchild 3 or any Fairchild subroutine for that matter helps you trash your David, which is actually advantageous if you are playing Retrieval Run or Levy. It means that the David is now ready to recur instead of being stuck on the table with no counters left. So these are things that you have to adjust and think of as you play against HB as Dumble Fox. Hope this was enlightening. Thanks for watching and happy night running as always. Goodbye.